The rain had been following us for miles, tapping against the windshield like a quiet warning. Adil sat beside me, his eyes fixed on the blurred road ahead, his silence as steady as the downpour. We'd been driving for hours, the darkness pressing in, the kind of night where the world feels smaller, more intimate, and far too honest. He was my son-in-law, my daughter's husband. Yet in that cramped car, under the dim glow of the dashboard lights, it felt as though we were two strangers who knew too much about each other's loneliness. When the road signs grew fewer and the rain heavier, he suggested we stop for the night. "You look tired," he said softly, glancing my way. His tone held the same gentle authority that had once made me trust him completely. I nodded, though my heart hesitated. There was nothing unusual about his offer, and yet something in the air had shifted. Something fragile and unspoken. We found a small hotel just off the highway. Its yellow sign flickered uncertainly, like it couldn't decide if it should stay lit or give in to the dark. Adil parked beneath the awning, then turned to me with a polite half-smile. "I'll check us in," he offered, already stepping out before I could respond. Through the rain-streaked glass, I watched him speak to the clerk, his movements calm and deliberate. He had always been like that. Composed, patient, carrying an ease that filled every space he entered. I had once admired it. Now, I found it difficult to look at. When he returned, droplets clinging to his hair, he said quietly, "They have one room left." His words lingered longer than they should have. Suspended between us, I could have protested, insisted we find another place, another option. But the truth was, I didn't. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something I couldn't yet name. We walked through the narrow hallway together, our footsteps echoing in rhythm. The walls smelled faintly of old polish and rain-soaked air. Inside the room, he placed the key on the table and exhaled. "You should rest," he said, his voice gentle again. But rest was impossible. As I stood by the window watching the storm consume the night, I realized this wasn't just a pause in our journey. It was a crossing, a quiet, dangerous threshold neither of us had planned to approach. And though nothing had yet been said, I already knew. Some silences carry the weight of everything we're too afraid to admit. Adil came into our lives 5 years ago, carrying the kind of quiet charm that earns trust without trying. He wasn't loud or boastful, just attentive. A man who listened more than he spoke. I remember the first time Sarah brought him home. My daughter's voice trembled with pride as she introduced him, her fingers wrapped around his like a promise. I had smiled then, thinking she'd found someone who would care for her the way every mother hopes her child will be cared for. And for years, he did. Their marriage was steady, not perfect, but peaceful. Adil worked hard. Sarah pursued her career, and they seemed content in their rhythm. I would visit sometimes, bringing food or staying over when my loneliness felt heavier than usual. After my husband passed, Adil began checking in more often. It was his idea, really. He said he didn't want me to feel alone. I didn't argue. It started with small gestures, helping me with repairs, driving me to appointments, joining me for tea when Sarah was away for work. I told myself it was kindness, nothing more. But kindness, when repeated in the quiet corners of grief, can become something dangerously tender. I began noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his voice softened when he asked if I'd eaten, how his laughter filled the silence of my house, like sunlight after rain. He reminded me of youth, of the part of myself that still longed to be seen, to matter beyond the roles life had assigned me. And yet, I never thought of him as anything but my daughter's husband. Until that night in the car, when the storm blurred the lines between comfort and closeness. As he unpacked the bags and laid out the extra blanket in the hotel room, I caught myself studying the curve of his shoulders, the tired gentleness in his movements. It was an innocent observation, and yet I felt guilty for it. There are moments when awareness itself Feels like betrayal. He looked up suddenly, catching my gaze. Are you okay? He asked, his tone careful, almost protective. Yes, I lied. Just tired. He smiled faintly, accepting my answer, though his eyes said he didn't believe it. In that fragile moment, I understood something I hadn't before. That temptation doesn't always come wrapped in desire. Sometimes, it arrives disguised as comfort, waiting quietly for the heart to let its guard down. Outside, the rain began to ease, but inside, something far more dangerous was beginning to stir. Something that neither of us had the courage to name. The room smelled faintly of rain and worn linen, the kind of scent that lingers after years of quiet stories. Adil sat on the edge of the chair near the window, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, the pale light reflecting off his face. I lay on the bed, pretending to rest, though my mind refused to still. The sound of the storm had faded to a soft drizzle, leaving behind a silence that felt too large for the small space we shared. For a long while, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that hums beneath the surface, thick with everything unsaid. I turned to face him, meaning only to ask if he was cold. But the words slipped away when our eyes met. There was something in his expression, a gentleness, a question, maybe even a plea, that made my pulse quicken. He broke the gaze first. You should sleep, he murmured. I can't, I admitted. The rain always keeps me awake. He smiled faintly. Sarah says the same thing. She plays music when she can't sleep. Hearing my daughter's name should have grounded me, but instead, it only deepened the ache. You must miss her, I said softly. He hesitated. I do, but sometimes missing someone feels easier than being near them, and realizing the distance hasn't really gone away. His honesty unsettled me. I recognized the exhaustion behind it, the quiet fatigue that comes from loving someone who's no longer looking your way. I knew that feeling too well. Adil, I began, choosing my words carefully. Marriage isn't about constant closeness. It's about holding on through the spaces between. He nodded slowly. And yet, the spaces start to feel like walls. The truth of it hung between us. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would ease the heaviness in his voice. But I was afraid. Afraid that compassion would sound too much like longing. I turned away, but the reflection in the window betrayed me. Two figures framed in dim light, suspended in an intimacy neither of us had intended. The weight of what wasn't happening pressed harder than anything that could. When the clock struck midnight, I rose to make tea. My hands trembled slightly as I poured the water, the silence behind me almost unbearable. Adel joined me at the counter, close enough that I could feel his warmth. Thank you for coming for me tonight, I said quietly. He looked at me for a long moment before replying. You don't have to thank me. I wanted to. And in that simple sentence, something fragile shifted. Not a confession, not even a promise, just the quiet acknowledgement of what neither of us dared to name. Outside, the rain began again, gentle but insistent, like the heart reminding us that even silence can be dangerous if it lingers too long. Morning came quietly, as though the night had never happened. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Adel was already awake, sitting by the window with his hands clasped, his face drawn in thought. For a moment, I simply watched him. The stillness of his posture, the faint crease between his brows. He looked young and tired all at once. Did you sleep at all? I asked. My voice came out softer than I intended. He shook his head without looking at me. Not really. Too many thoughts, I guess. I knew what he meant, though neither of us dared to name it. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything we'd said the night before. As I rose to pack my things, the air between us thickened again. Not with words, but with awareness. Every glance, every movement carried a quiet understanding of what almost happened. What still might if we weren't careful. Adil finally turned toward me, his voice low. I hope last night didn't make you uncomfortable. It was such a simple question, yet it landed like a confession. No, I said quickly, too quickly. It was just a long day. He studied me, his eyes searching for something I wasn't sure I could hide. You don't have to pretend. I felt it too, that silence. The air stilled. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop between us. I met his gaze then, my throat tightening. Some feelings, I said carefully, are meant to be acknowledged only so we can let them go. He exhaled slowly, nodding, though his eyes glimmered with something close to sorrow. You're right, I don't know what came over me. It wasn't wrong to feel, I said, my voice trembling despite my effort to steady it. It would only be wrong to stay in it. He looked down, his jaw tightening, as if he were holding back words too heavy to speak. For a long time, we stood in silence. Two people suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and irreversible. Then he said quietly, You remind me of peace, Ami. Not the kind you find in people, but the kind you lose and don't realize until it's gone. The words cut through me, tender and devastating. I wanted to answer, to comfort him, but I couldn't trust myself to speak. Instead, I turned toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. Outside, the road waited, long, endless, and safe. I stepped into the sunlight, drawing a deep breath that tasted of rain and restraint. Behind me, I heard him whisper something I couldn't quite catch. Or perhaps I didn't want to, because some truths, once heard, can never be unheard. And I already carried enough of them for a lifetime. Weeks passed before I allowed myself to think about that night again. Life, as it tends to, moved forward, quietly, insistently, as though nothing had shifted. But something had. It wasn't visible to anyone else, not even to Adil, who carried on with his usual composure, his visits growing fewer, his voice steadier. And yet, every time I heard his name in conversation, a small tremor rippled beneath the calm surface I'd built. Sarah called often, her laughter bright and distracted. She spoke of work, of plans, of Adil's quiet support. You should have seen him last week, she said once, her voice full of affection. He surprised me with dinner after a long day. You raised him well, Emmy. I smiled at her words, though something inside me tightened. Raised him. She said it like a compliment, unaware of how close that truth had come to breaking me. Time became my unspoken penance. Each passing day put distance between us, softening the memory, like light fading through fog. And yet, I could never forget the quiet moment in that hotel room. Not for its wrongness, but for its reminder of something I had long buried. That loneliness, when left unattended, finds its own dangerous language. When I saw Adil again months later, at a family gathering, our eyes met across the room. He smiled politely, the kind of smile shared between people who know more than they'll ever admit. There was no tension, no lingering pull, only understanding. We had both learned the weight of silence and the mercy of restraint. That night, as I sat alone on my porch, the sky dark and familiar, I found myself thinking not of guilt, but of gratitude. Some moments exist only to teach us how fragile the heart can be and how strong it must become afterward. I realized then that love isn't always about possession or passion. Sometimes it's about letting go, about choosing distance to protect what remains unbroken. Adil and I would never speak of that night again. It would live quietly between us, not as a secret, but as a reminder that even the purest intentions can wander dangerously close to the edge when the soul grows weary. And so, life continued, steady, imperfect, and real. The world didn't change, but I had, because once you've looked at someone, and seen your own reflection in their loneliness, you understand that infidelity doesn't always wear the face of betrayal. Sometimes, it looks like kindness held too long.